My family used me to pay their house for 3 years, but when they tried to kick me out so my golden child brother could live rent-free, I legally bought the house and evicted everyone without mercy. I'm 27 years old, work in it, consulting, and for years I was paying my parents' bills while living in the family home, thinking that someday it would be mine. You know, because they themselves promised me 1,000 times. But it turns out that all that time, all that money I invested, all that effort, was basically to keep a roof over my older brother Landon's head, the perfect son who never did anything wrong in his life according to my parents. The thing is, looking back, I should have seen it coming since we were kids. But I guess when you live something every day, it's hard to realize how toxic it really is until it hits you in the face. I grew up being the second child, the one who went unnoticed while Landon was treated like he walked on water. I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it was like living in someone's shadow constantly. Landon would get a B in math, and my parents would celebrate it like he'd won a full scholarship to Harvard. I'd get straight A's and barely get a well done without them looking up from the newspaper. Landon played baseball in high school, and my mom went to all his games with giant signs. I was in debate club and made it to states 2 years in a row. And my parents didn't go to a single competition because they always had something more important to do, which was usually something related to Landon. It was frustrating. Like really frustrating. But as a kid, you don't have the tools to understand that what's happening isn't normal. You just assume that's how things are, and that maybe if you try harder, eventually your parents will see you the same way. Spoiler alert, it never happened. When it was time to go to college, Landon decided he wanted to go to a super expensive private school in South Carolina, and my parents literally took out a loan to pay for it completely. Tuition, dorm, food, everything. I went to a state university with a partial scholarship and worked part-time at a Starbucks all 4 years to cover the rest. Because my parents told me they couldn't help me financially after what they'd invested in Landon. The irony is that Landon graduated with a business administration degree that he never used for anything, while I got a degree in information technology that got me a decent job like 6 months after graduating. But well, I guess in my parents' minds Landon's success was more important than mine because he was the firstborn or something. I never really understood the logic. After college, I stayed in North Carolina close to home while looking for work. I found a position at a consulting company in Charlotte that paid well, and my parents, who by then had both retired, Dad had worked in manufacturing and Mom was a nurse, suggested I stay living with them to save money. They told me, "Stay here, pay some of the bills to help us because with retirement we can't afford everything, and when we have to move to a smaller place or whatever, the house will be yours." Seemed like a good deal, right? I'd have a place to live without paying full rent, they'd have help with expenses, and eventually I'd inherit the family home. Win-win. Or so I thought. So, I stayed. I paid the full mortgage every month, like $1,200, plus utilities, internet, cable, basically everything except groceries that my parents bought with their retirement money. It was like $1,800 a month that I was putting in, which was a lot, but I thought it was an investment in my future. You know what I mean? Plus, my parents constantly thanked me for it. My mom would tell me I was a wonderful son and that they didn't know what they'd do without me. My dad would pat me on the shoulder and say he was proud of how responsible I'd become. It felt good to be recognized for once in my life, though in retrospect I realized they only recognized me when it was useful to them. Meanwhile, Landon had moved to Austin, Texas, where he worked in sales for a tech startup, or so he said. He met Emily there. They got married super fast, like after knowing each other for about 6 months. And my parents went to the wedding and everything. Paid their part of the trip with money that was technically mine because I was covering all their expenses at home. They didn't invite me to be part of the ceremony or anything. I just went as another guest, while Landon had all his friends as groomsmen. Emily seemed nice, actually. She was an elementary school teacher and had that vibe of a genuinely kind person, and I remember thinking that maybe she'd make Landon mature a bit. Spoiler, it didn't work out that way. The first 2 years of my arrangement with my parents were relatively calm. I worked, paid the bills, lived my life, and they did their retired people things. Gardening, bridge groups, occasional trips to visit friends. Landon would call every 2 weeks or so, always talking about how amazing his life in Texas was, how well he was doing at work, though he never specified how well, how happy Emily was. My parents would melt with every call. It was like Landon was a celebrity or something. I could be sitting right there in the living room, and Mom would be on the phone with Landon saying, "Oh, son, we miss you so much. When are you coming to visit?" While she saw me every day and barely asked how work went. But then, like 2.5 years into paying for everything, things started getting weird. Mom began making casual comments about when I was planning to move out. Things like, "Don't you want to have your own place? At your age, I already had my own apartment. Don't you think it would be good to have more independence?" At first, I thought she was worried about me. You know, like a mother worried that her 6-year-old son still lives at home. But then I started noticing a pattern. The comments always came after Landon called. Eventually, I figured out what was happening. My parents were trying to get me out of the house because Landon and Emily were considering moving back to North Carolina. When I finally confronted her about it, Mom admitted it, but like it was the most normal thing in the world. She said, "Well, yes, Landon and Emily are thinking about coming back, and they'd need a place to stay while they look for their own house. It would be temporary, obviously." I asked her, "Temporary how long?" And she said, "I don't know, a few months maybe, a year maximum." I told her that was ridiculous, that I'd been paying for the house for years and that they'd promised me it would be mine. And she responded with, "But Landon needs it more than you. You already have a stable job and can get an apartment. Landon is going through a difficult time." Apparently, the startup where he worked wasn't doing well and they'd reduced him to part-time, and Emily was looking for work as a teacher but hadn't found anything yet in Austin. The conversation got tense, like very tense, and Dad jumped in, but only to say we should all calm down and talk like adults. I told him I was talking like an adult, and that what they were asking was completely unfair, that I'd literally invested tens of thousands of dollars in that house with the promise that someday it would be mine, and now they were asking me to leave so my brother, who'd never contributed anything, could live there for free. Mom got angry and said I was being selfish. That family helps each other. That Landon would do the same for me if I needed it. Which was an obvious lie, because Landon had never done anything for anyone but himself in his entire life. About 2 months of constant tension in the house went by. My parents kept pressuring me to move out. I kept saying no until we had an agreement in writing about the house, and they refused to put anything in writing. Mom started making passive-aggressive comments about how I was preventing Landon from improving his life, as if somehow I was the villain of the story. Dad avoided the topic completely, which was typical of him. He always let Mom handle difficult situations while he hid behind the newspaper or in the garage fixing things that weren't broken. Then Landon and Emily finally decided to move back to North Carolina. They hadn't found their own house yet because apparently their credit was a mess, like really bad, and they needed a place to stay while they fixed it. My parents gave me an ultimatum: move out by the end of the month or we're going to have a serious problem. I asked them if they expected me to stop paying the bills too, and Mom said, "Well, no, obviously we still need help with that, but you can pay it from your new place." I mean, they wanted me to move out, pay my own rent, and also keep paying the mortgage and bills on the family home so Landon could live there for free with his wife. The audacity was impressive, honestly. I told them no, that if I left I'd stop paying everything, and that they could manage with their retirement money or ask Landon to contribute. Mom went hysterical, literally screaming about how I was destroying the family, how I was an ungrateful son, how after everything they'd done for me I was abandoning them. I reminded her that I'd paid for their house for almost 3 years, and she said that was different because I lived there and used their resources, as if the $1,800 monthly that I paid didn't more than cover any resources I used. The conversation ended with Mom telling me I had 2 weeks to get out, or she'd pack my things herself. So, I did something that probably seems petty, but that in the moment seemed like the only reasonable option. I waited until the night before the deadline, packed all my things quietly while my parents slept, and moved to an apartment I'd been secretly looking for during those 2 weeks. I left a note on the kitchen table that said, "I moved out like you asked. Stop counting on my money for the bills. Good luck." And I left around midnight, loaded my truck with everything I could, and hired a moving company to pick up my bigger furniture the next day while I was at work. I blocked my parents' numbers, Landon's, basically my whole family, because I knew that when they realized what had happened, they'd try to contact me to manipulate me and make me feel guilty. The first few weeks were liberating. I'm not going to lie. For the first time in years, I didn't have to deal with Mom's comments about Landon. I didn't have to see Dad avoid confrontations. I didn't have to feel that constant pressure of being the less favored but more useful son. My apartment was small, basically a studio, but it was mine, paid with my money, no family strings attached. I worked, came home, cooked for myself, watched Netflix, slept well for the first time in months. I'd forgotten what it felt like not to have that constant knot in my stomach from living with people who clearly didn't value you. But like 6 weeks after I'd moved out, I got a call from a number I didn't have blocked. It was Aunt Clara, who's technically my mom's cousin, but we always call her Aunt, and she was furious with me. She started yelling at me about how I'd abandoned my parents, how they were elderly people who needed help, how family doesn't give up on family, blah blah blah. I let her talk for a few minutes and then I explained, calmly, the whole situation from my perspective. I told her about the years of favoritism, about how I paid for the house for 3 years with the promise it would be mine, about how they asked me to leave so Landon could live for free while I kept paying for everything from another place. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Aunt Clara said something that changed absolutely everything. She said, "Wait, you didn't know about the second mortgage, did you?" I asked her what she was talking about, and she assumed I already knew because according to her it was obvious. Turns out that like 3 years ago, when Landon and Emily got married and moved to Austin, they needed money for the deposit on their apartment and to buy a car because the one they had had broken down. My parents, in their infinite wisdom and partiality, took out a second mortgage on the family home, like $40,000, and gave it to Landon. $40,000 they probably were never going to get back, but according to Mom, it was an investment in Landon's future. I felt like I'd been punched in the chest. I couldn't breathe right. I asked Aunt Clara if she was sure, and she said yes, that she'd been present when they discussed it because Mom had asked her for advice about whether it was a good idea. Aunt Clara had told them no, that it was crazy to take out a second mortgage at their age being retired, but Mom insisted, saying that Landon was going to pay them back eventually. Obviously, that never happened. And the part that really made me angry, the part that made all the anger I'd been holding in for years come to the surface, was that the second mortgage had been taken out right when I started paying the bills. But the last almost 3 years, I wasn't just paying the original mortgage, I was paying the second mortgage that my parents had taken out to give money to my brother. I thanked Aunt Clara for telling me, hung up, and immediately went to the bank the next day. I asked to speak with someone about my parents' mortgage account, explained that I'd been making payments for years, and asked if they could confirm how many mortgages there were on the property. The bank representative checked and confirmed there were 2. An original mortgage that was almost paid off when I started contributing, and a second mortgage of $42,000, taken out 3 years ago, and that my monthly payments had been covering both. I did the math mentally. I'd probably paid like $15,000 of that second mortgage without even knowing it, money that effectively went directly into Landon's pockets. I felt betrayed, like beyond betrayed. I felt like I'd been used and manipulated in the most blatant way possible. And the worst part was that my parents had never told me. They'd never given me the option to decide if I wanted to pay a debt they'd taken on to benefit my brother. They just assumed I'd keep paying blindly because I was the obedient son who did what he was asked without asking questions. About 2 more months went by. I was still in my apartment, living my life, ignoring the occasional attempts from my family to contact me through mutual acquaintances or new numbers that I immediately blocked. Then I received a letter from the bank addressed to me at my new apartment. Apparently, my parents had given them my new address when the bank started calling them about late payments. The letter said the mortgage was in default for 2 months, that if payments weren't made in the next 30 days, they were going to start foreclosure proceedings, and that, since I'd been the one making payments recently, they were trying to contact me too to find a resolution. I'm not going to lie. Part of me wanted to let the house go into foreclosure. I wanted my parents to face the consequences of their decisions, for Landon to see that his parasitic lifestyle had limits, for all of them to understand that I wasn't a personal bank they could keep withdrawing money from indefinitely. But another part of me the part that still had some love for my parents despite everything, didn't want them to lose the family home where they'd lived for 30 years. And honestly, there was also a vindictive part of me that saw an opportunity. I called the bank and asked how much was needed to catch up with payments. They told me like $3,600, counting late fees. Then I asked how much was left on both mortgages total. The amount was like $47,000, which was manageable considering what I'd been saving since I moved out and stopped paying my parents' bills. I told the representative I was interested in saving the house from foreclosure, but that I needed to talk with the owners first about terms. The bank told me I had 30 days to figure something out or they'd start the legal process. So I did something that probably makes me sound like a manipulator, but honestly I felt it was poetic justice. I unblocked Mom's number and called her. She answered immediately, super excited to hear my voice, saying, "Son, it's so good you're calling. We've missed you so much. We need to talk." I told her I'd received the letter from the bank, and the tone of her voice changed completely. She got defensive, saying it wasn't her fault that I'd decided to stop paying, that they were doing the best they could with their retirement money, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. I asked her how Landon was doing living in the house, and she admitted he wasn't contributing much either because he was still looking for full-time work and money was tight. I told her I had an offer for them. I'd explain how to save the house from foreclosure, but only under my terms. Mom asked what terms, sounding hopeful, and I told her we needed to have a family meeting, all of us together, including Landon. She agreed immediately, too desperate to question what I had planned. The meeting was at the family home on a Saturday afternoon. I arrived with a folder full of documents I'd printed, bank statements showing all the payments I'd made for 3 years, copies of the second mortgage I'd obtained from the bank, calculations of how much I'd contributed in total, everything. Mom, Dad, Landon, and Emily were sitting in the living room when I walked in. Landon looked uncomfortable, like he knew something was coming. Emily greeted me kindly but looked confused about why she was there. I sat down and put all the documents on the coffee table. I told them I'd investigated everything about the house finances, about the second mortgage, about how much money I'd paid without knowing I was subsidizing Landon's lifestyle. Mom tried to interrupt, but I raised my hand and told her it was my turn to talk, and they were going to listen. I explained exactly how much money I'd contributed. $65,000 total over 3 years, counting mortgage, utilities, repairs, everything. I showed them how $15,000 of those dollars had gone directly to paying a debt that had been taken on to give money to Landon. Landon tried to defend himself, saying he hadn't asked our parents to take out that second mortgage, that they'd offered it. I told him that didn't change the fact that he'd taken the money, knowing it would eventually have to be paid somehow, and that apparently he didn't care that I was the one who ended up paying it without knowing. Emily looked mortified, whispered something like, "I didn't know things were like this," and Landon told her to shut up. Then I gave them my offer. I would pay what was owed to the bank to avoid foreclosure and also pay the rest of both mortgages, the remaining $47,000, but only if my parents transferred ownership completely to my name. The house would be legally mine, and they could continue living there as my tenants, without paying rent as long as they behaved and respected that it was my property. Landon would have to leave or start paying market rent, his choice. If they didn't accept, I'd wash my hands of the matter and they could lose the house in foreclosure, and good luck finding another place to live being retired with ruined credit. Mom exploded, screaming that this was blackmail. How dare I extort my own family, that she'd never raised me to be so cruel. I responded, very calmly, that it wasn't blackmail, it was business. I was offering to save their house and give them a place to live for free for the rest of their lives. The only thing I was asking in return was that they finally recognize my contribution by giving me what they'd always promised me, the house. The only difference was that now it would be immediately instead of eventually, and that I'd be legally protected instead of trusting in empty promises. Dad spoke for the first time in the whole conversation. He said they needed time to think about it, to consult with a lawyer maybe. I told them they had 20 days because that's what the bank had given them before proceeding with foreclosure, and that if I didn't have an answer by then, my offer expired. I got up to leave, and Landon said something about how I'd always been resentful, how all this was about jealousy because he was the favorite. I told him he was right. He'd always been the favorite, and look where that had gotten him. At 31 years old, with no house of his own, no stable job, depending on his elderly parents to survive. And I left. The next few days were complete silence. Then, like a week later, Dad called me. He said they'd talked with a lawyer and that technically what I was proposing was legal. That if I paid the mortgages and they transferred the property, it was a valid agreement. He said Mom was still furious, but that he understood my position, that they'd made mistakes in how they'd treated me, and that if that's what it took to save the house, they agreed. I told them I needed the agreement in writing, notarized, before giving a single dollar to the bank. We met at a lawyer's office a week later. My parents signed the papers, transferring ownership to my name. I signed documents committing to pay the remaining mortgages and to allow them to live there without rent under certain conditions that included maintaining the house in good condition, not making structural changes without my permission, and allowing me access when necessary for inspections or repairs. Landon didn't come to the meeting. Apparently, he was too angry to be in the same room as me. I paid the past due debt immediately and started making arrangements to pay the rest. The bank was happy to have the matter resolved and to have a new official owner on the documents. Technically, the house was mine now. My name on the title, my responsibility, my property. It felt surreal, honestly. After years of feeling invisible and used, I finally had something tangible to prove my effort had been worth it, even though I'd had to fight for it in a way I never imagined I'd have to with my own family. The next thing I had to do was deal with Landon. I sent him a message, since technically now I was his landlord, telling him he had two options. Start paying $800 rent per month, which is less than a room would normally cost in that area, or move out in the next 60 days. Landon responded with a message full of insults, calling me basically everything you can think of, saying he'd never pay me a cent, that the house should belong to our parents, not me, that I'd manipulated the situation to steal from them. I responded that I had the legal documents proving the house was mine, that if he didn't pay rent or move voluntarily, I'd start a formal eviction process. He didn't pay. Obviously, he didn't pay. So I did exactly what I said I would. I hired a lawyer and started the eviction process. In North Carolina, the process can take between 1 and 3 months depending on various things. And Landon fought every step of the way, trying to argue that the agreement between me and my parents had been under duress, that he had a right to be there because my parents had given him permission. The judge reviewed all the documents, saw that I was the legal owner, that Landon had no rental contract nor was paying anything, and ordered the eviction. Emily left Landon like 2 weeks before he had to move out. Apparently, she'd been questioning many things about their relationship during all this drama, and when she realized Landon had no intention of getting stable work or contributing economically to anything, she decided enough was enough. She moved in with a friend in Charlotte and started the divorce process. Can't say I blame her, honestly. She'd spent years with a guy who clearly expected everyone else to carry his responsibilities while he did nothing. Landon finally moved to the apartment he shared with a roommate, working at a call center or something, basically the bare minimum necessary to survive. I haven't talked to him since the day of the final eviction, when he came to pick up his last things. Mom cried that day, saying I'd divided the family. How could I do this to my own brother? I reminded her that Landon had done it to himself, that at any point in the last months, he could have chosen to take responsibility, pay rent, contribute in some way, but instead he chose to fight and insult and expect everyone else to solve his problems. Things with my parents are weird now. They still live in the house, which is technically my house, and they pay their share of utilities as we agreed. Mom barely talks to me, only what's necessary, and when she does, there's obvious resentment in her voice. Dad is a bit more cordial. Sometimes he calls me to ask how I am, or to inform me about something that needs repair in the house. I visit every 2 months or so to check that everything's okay, and it's uncomfortable every time, like walking through an emotional minefield where any word could cause an explosion. Aunt Clara called me a few months ago to tell me I should consider forgiving Landon. That family is family, and that holding grudges only hurt me. I told her it wasn't a grudge. It was boundary setting. That I'd spent enough time being the person everyone trampled on, and that I'd finally decided to value myself, even if that meant distancing myself from toxic people. even if those people were my own family. She didn't understand, or didn't want to understand, but honestly, I don't care what she thinks anymore. And the house is almost paid off now. I have like about $12,000 left that I should finish paying in the next year. I've thought about what to do with it eventually. Whether to sell it when my parents are no longer there or can't live there alone anymore, or if I should rent it, or maybe even move back in if I ever have a family of my own. For now, it's simply an investment that finally belongs to me legally after years of contributing without recognition. I don't know if I did the right thing in how I handled everything. There are days where I feel guilty, where I think maybe I was too harsh, that maybe I should have looked for a kinder or more compassionate solution. But then I remember all the years of being ignored, of being used, of watching my brother receive everything, while I received crumbs of attention and mountains of expectations. I remember the betrayal of discovering I'd been paying for my parents' financial mistakes that exclusively benefited Landon. And in those moments, I know what I did was necessary for my own mental health and well-being. My life now is calmer. I still work in consulting. I'm doing well. I've been saving real money for the first time because I'm not pouring it into a bottomless pit of my family's finances. I go out with friends, travel occasionally, have hobbies I'd abandoned during those years of constant stress. I feel lighter, I guess, like I'd taken a weight off my shoulders that I didn't even realize I was carrying. It's weird to think about how much emotional energy I spent trying to win the approval of people who clearly were never going to give it to me, no matter how hard I tried. The other day, I ran into Emily at a coffee shop in Charlotte. It was super awkward at first, but she greeted me kindly and asked if she could sit with me for a moment. She told me the divorce had finalized a few months ago, that she was working as a teacher now at a school near where she lived, and that she was much happier. She thanked me for what I did, which surprised me. She said the drama with the house had opened her eyes about Landon, about how he always expected others to solve his problems, and that leaving that relationship had been the best thing she could have done. I told her I hoped things went well for her, and I really meant it. Emily had never done anything bad to me. She'd just had the bad luck of marrying my brother. Part of me hopes he eventually matures, that he finds stability, that he learns he can't depend on others forever. Another part of me thinks he'll probably stay the same, blaming everyone else for his problems, expecting someone else to rescue him every time things get difficult. Honestly, it's not my problem anymore. The relationship with my parents will probably never be what it should have been. I no longer need their approval to feel valuable or successful. Dad, I don't know. Maybe with time we can rebuild something like a functional relationship, but I'm not holding my breath. For now, I'm focused on my own life, on building my own future, without the chains of expectations and favoritism that marked the first 27 years of my life. And if that makes me selfish or cruel, according to my family, well, I guess I can live with that.